Rain fell lightly over harbor, stop convenience store, the kind of rain that made the neon sign flicker and the pavement outside shine like wet glass. Sophie Bennett was closing out the register for the night, counting the same stack of bills twice, because her hands were too tired to trust the first count. 3 years of night shifts had taught her that exhaustion made even simple math feel like a foreign language. In the back room, her daughter Lily sat at a folding table. 6 years old, small and quiet, coloring with a blue crayon, a worn stuffed rabbit named Bunny tucked under one arm. Lily was the kind of child who noticed everything and said almost nothing about it. The way a customer's shoes squeaked on wet tile, the exact rhythm of the rain against the window, the flicker of the sign outside that blinked twice before staying lit. Sophie used to joke that her daughter missed nothing, not even the things adults trained themselves not to see. That night, it wasn't a joke anymore. Lily heard something outside, a scrape, a low voice arguing in the alley behind the store. She pushed the back door open, just a crack, the way children do when curiosity is stronger than caution, and looked out into the rain. A man stood with his back against the brick wall, another man in front of him, blocking his path. "Matteo needs to know," the cornered man said, voice shaking. "Matteo only knows what I let him know," the other answered, calm as a closed door. Lily saw black gloves, a silver ring catching what little light there was, a pale scar along the man's right wrist as he raised his hand. Then the cornered man crumpled to the ground, and the alley went silent except for the rain. The man in the gloves turned, slow and unhurried, and found Lily standing in the open doorway. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He crouched low enough to meet her eyes and whispered 4 words into the wet dark. "You saw nothing." Then he folded into the shadows like he had never been there at all. Sophie found her daughter a minute later, trembling, unable to speak, one small finger pointing at an alley that now held nothing but rain. The police came. They found no body. It had already been moved. The security camera above the back door had lost exactly 12 minutes of footage, and by morning, everyone at Harbor Stop had quietly decided the same thing. The tired cashier's daughter had imagined the whole thing, because sometimes the child no one believes is the only one who ever tells the truth. Sophie sat in a hard plastic chair at the police station the next afternoon. Lily curled silently against her side and told an officer everything her daughter had managed to describe. The gloves, the ring, the scar, the whispered warning. The officer barely looked up from his paperwork. He'd heard 100 stories that started with a scared parent and a strange claim, and his face had already decided which category this one belonged to before Sophie finished her second sentence. "She's 6, Sophie said, voice shaking but steady. "She does not know how to invent murder." The officer wrote nothing down. Harold Finch, her manager at Harbor Stop, was waiting for her when she returned for her next shift, arms crossed, expression already annoyed before she said a word. "You're scaring off customers with a disturbed kid hanging around the break room," he told her. "Maybe your kid needs a doctor, not a detective." Customers had started whispering by then. "Crazy kid, poor woman, dealing with that alone." And Sophie heard every word, the way you hear things you're too proud to react to in public and too exhausted to forget in private. Sophie bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood and said nothing, because she needed the paycheck more than she needed to win the argument. 2 days later, Harold cut her name from the schedule and called it a business decision. Sophie understood, the way a person understands a bruise before they see it, that someone had wanted her gone, not because she was a bad cashier, but because her daughter had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. That night, a folded piece of paper appeared under the door of their apartment. "Your daughter saw nothing. Teach her to forget." Sophie read it twice, hands shaking, and felt the last of her doubt collapse. Lily hadn't imagined anything. The man in the alley knew exactly who had watched him. Lily saw the note over her mother's shoulder and slid silently beneath the kitchen table, knees pulled to her chest, whispering 3 words that made no sense to anyone but her. "The ring man." That was the first full sentence Lily had spoken in 2 days. Sophie noticed a black car idling outside their building that evening, engine running, headlights off, going nowhere and needing to go nowhere to make its point. She packed 1 bag before dawn, Lily's coat, Bunny, a handful of blue crayons, and the last of the cash from a drawer that used to hold rent money, and left the only home they'd had in 3 years without looking back. She had $6 in her pocket and nowhere in the city that felt safe. So she walked, Lily's small hand locked in hers, through the rain, toward the only warm light she could remember seeing on the edge of town, a diner that never seemed to close. Rosa's diner sat at the edge of the city, the kind of place that stayed open all night, not because business demanded it, but because someone, somewhere, still believed a warm light in the dark mattered to somebody. Sophie pushed open the door with $6 left in her pocket, and Lily half asleep against her side, rain dripping from both their coats, onto a checkered floor, worn smooth by decades of tired feet. She ordered 1 bowl of soup, told the waitress she wasn't hungry herself, and watched Lily eat in small, careful spoonfuls, counting each one like it might be the last for a while. An elderly woman appeared minutes later with a second bowl and a plate of bread, setting them down without a word, without a bill, without a single question. "A mother running in the rain never runs without a reason," Rosa Bellini said quietly, pulling a chair close enough to sit, not close enough to crowd. Sophie started crying before she could stop herself. The first kindness anyone had offered her in weeks. Rosa didn't ask what had happened. She simply refilled Sophie's coffee and let the silence between them be gentle instead of empty. The bell above the door rang again near midnight, and the entire diner changed the way a room changes when a storm walks in wearing a suit. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. 2 men flanked a third, taller, colder, moving with the kind of stillness that made people instinctively lower their voices. Sophie didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. She simply knew, the way prey knows a predator has entered the clearing. Matteo Cross scanned the room out of habit before his eyes settled on the corner booth. A tired woman, a silent child, a stuffed rabbit missing 1 button eye. "Who are they?" he asked Rosa, not unkindly but not warmly either. "People who needed a door unlocked," Rosa said simply. Matteo walked closer, unhurried, and looked down at Sophie with an expression that gave nothing away. "This diner isn't a shelter," he said. Sophie stood, legs shaking, terror climbing her spine, and looked him directly in the eye anyway. "Then tell me where a mother is supposed to go," she said. "When the police laugh at her child, and the killer already knows her address." Something shifted behind Matteo's eyes. Not softness, not yet. Just attention. The rare, careful attention of a dangerous man who had just heard something he hadn't expected. "What killer?" he asked. Sophie told him quickly, quietly, the words tumbling out of her like a dam finally giving way. The alley, the note, the 12 missing minutes, the daughter no one believed. Lily stayed pressed against her mother's side through all of it, silent, watching Matteo's face for something she couldn't yet name. The bell above the door rang a 3rd time. A man walked in, easy smile, calm shoulders, greeted immediately by Matteo's men with the familiarity reserved for family. "Nico," Matteo said, nodding once. Lily dropped her spoon. It happened so fast, Sophie almost missed it. The color leaving her daughter's face, her small hand gripping Sophie's sleeve, hard enough to bruise, her whole body beginning to shake. Then Lily pointed, one small finger, aimed directly across the room at Nico Varela, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Poor child," Nico said, easy and unbothered. "She looks frightened of everything." But Lily didn't lower her hand. She touched her own wrist, then pointed again. Not at Nico's face, but at the silver ring catching the light on his right hand. Matteo went very still. He knew that ring. He had given it to Nico himself years ago, the night Nico saved his life outside a burning warehouse, the night Matteo had called him brother for the first time. "Take off your glove," Matteo said quietly. The whole diner went silent, the way rooms obey men who rarely need to ask twice. Nico's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes flickered. Slowly, he peeled the black glove from his right hand. A pale scar ran along his wrist, exactly where Lily had touched her own. Lily made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Nico laughed, low and dismissive. "You're really going to entertain a broken child's fantasy?" Sophie's fear cracked open into fury. "My daughter is not broken," she said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "And she is not a liar." Matteo's jaw tightened. He didn't accuse Nico, not yet. Instead, he turned to his men and said quietly, "Take them to the safe house." Sophie pulled back instinctively. "My daughter is not evidence." "No," Matteo said. "She is the reason someone is afraid." The safe house sat outside the city, quiet, guarded, and utterly unfamiliar to a woman who had learned not to trust anything that came with locked doors and strangers holding the keys. Sophie paced the living room the first night, certain Matteo intended to use Lily as a piece of evidence in some larger war she didn't understand. Matteo visited the next morning, standing at a careful distance, the way he always seemed to when Lily was near. "In my city," he told Sophie, "children do not pay for the sins of men." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, exhaustion and grief and disbelief fighting for space behind her eyes. "Powerful men always say rules," she said, "until those rules cost them something." The words landed harder than she expected them to. Matteo said nothing, but something in his expression told her the sentence had found a place to live inside him. Rosa arrived that afternoon with a pot of soup and a sewing kit, settling into a kitchen chair like she owned the place, which, in every way that mattered, she did. While she stitched Bunny's torn seam back together, needle-moving with the patience of someone who had mended far worse things than a stuffed rabbit, she told Sophie quietly that Matteo had lost his own mother to a war between families when he was barely older than Lily. Rosa herself had hidden him in her diner's back room once, fed him when no one else would, never let him forget what it felt like to be small and unprotected. "He named the diner after me instead of her," Rosa said, eyes somewhere far away. "I never asked him to. I think it was the only apology he knew how to give." "It doesn't make him a good man," Rosa added, "but it explains the rule he never breaks." Sophie turned that over in her mind for a long time after Rosa left. The idea that even a man like Matteo Cross had once been a frightened child no one believed was worth saving, and that somewhere, underneath the fear he inspired now, that child might still be listening. Over the following days, Lily's crayon drawings began piling up on the safe house's long table. A silver ring, black gloves, a scarred wrist, an old iron bridge, a building with a rolling steel door, and in the corner of one page, half hidden beneath the bridge's iron rails, A broken freezer door with one word scratched into the metal. Vega. Matteo spread them out one evening and felt something in his chest tighten with every page. He had watched grown men lie under pressure and hold their composure. He had never once seen anything as unflinchingly honest as a traumatized child's crayon. He noticed something else too. The drawings weren't random. Each one repeated details with a precision that no 6-year-old could sustain through imagination alone. The ring was always the same size, always on the same hand. The scar always curved the same way. Whatever Lily had witnessed, her mind had locked onto it with the kind of clarity trauma sometimes leaves behind. Sharp and unshakable even when words wouldn't come. His investigator, Nolan, brought news that made the pattern sharpen further. Tomas Vega, the organization's former accountant, had vanished the same night Lily stopped speaking. Days before, Tomas had sent Matteo a single unread message. "I found the leak. It is closer than you think." Nico, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, moved to protect himself the only way he knew, by attacking Sophie's credibility before anyone could attack his own. He told Matteo's men that Sophie was chasing money, that the child was unstable, that Matteo was risking the organization's stability over a stranger and her broken daughter. Some of the men, who had trusted Nico through a decade of shared danger, who had watched him bleed for the family, fought beside him, been kept alive by his instincts more than once, believed him without question. Loyalty built over years doesn't get undone by a single accusation, no matter how true. Matteo found himself torn in a way he hadn't been torn in years, between the loyalty of a man who had once pulled him from a burning car, and the terror he had watched flicker behind a 6-year-old's eyes. Sophie overheard him questioning it one evening, his voice low, asking Nolan whether a traumatized child could really be trusted to identify anyone accurately. She walked into the room without waiting to be invited. "Everyone called my daughter crazy," she said, "because believing her was inconvenient. Don't become one of them." Matteo didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sophie held his gaze without flinching, exhausted and afraid, but refusing, as she always had, to back down when it came to Lily. That night, standing quietly in the hallway outside Lily's door, Matteo watched her sleep with Bunny clutched against her chest. Her hand moved in slow circles against the blanket, drawing an invisible ring, and she murmured the same 3 words she'd been whispering for weeks. The ring man. Something inside Matteo, some old guarded certainty about who deserved trust and who didn't, quietly rearranged itself. He chose in that moment to believe her. Nolan's next discovery landed heavier still. Harold Finch, the store manager who had cut Sophie's schedule, had received a quiet payment from a shell account 2 days after Sophie was fired. A payment traced, through 3 careful layers, back to a name connected to Nico. Sophie hadn't just been dismissed. She had been pushed out of the one place that might have protected her, on purpose, by someone who understood exactly what her daughter had seen. Nolan also confirmed what Tomas had died trying to prove. A small red notebook, kept off the official ledgers, hidden somewhere near the old iron bridge that appeared again and again in Lily's drawings. No one yet knew exactly where. Nico, watching Matteo's investigation tighten around him, understood he was running out of time. If the child remembered anything more, if she pointed at one more detail he couldn't explain away, there would be no story left to spin. He decided, quietly and coldly, that Lily would have to disappear before she remembered anything else. Nico arrived at the safe house 2 nights later, while Matteo was away, calm and composed, claiming Matteo had sent him to move them somewhere more secure. Sophie knew instantly something was wrong. The easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the way his men positioned themselves near the exits instead of waiting by the car. Lily saw Nico's face through the window and slid beneath the kitchen table before Sophie could even process why her own body had gone cold. The lights cut out a heartbeat later. Shouting erupted outside as Nico's men overwhelmed the guards at the door. Sophie fought back with whatever her hands could find. A heavy glass, a kitchen knife she'd never expected to need, but there were too many of them, and Nico was faster than fear allowed her to be. He took Lily. In the chaos, Bunny and a small blue crayon fell near the back door, left behind like breadcrumbs. A frightened child had thought to drop on purpose. Matteo arrived minutes too late. Sophie was on her knees in the wreckage of the living room, sobbing, more furious than she had ever been in her life. She crossed the room and slapped him before he could speak, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. "You promised she was safe," she said, voice breaking apart. Matteo didn't defend himself. He didn't move away. He simply knelt down, picked up Bunny from the floor, and held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters more than it should. "Then I'll bring her home," he said quietly. It wasn't the voice of a Mafia boss protecting a witness anymore. It was the voice of a man who had just realized he was protecting family. Matteo intended to leave Sophie behind, safe and guarded, while he tore the city apart looking for Nico. Sophie refused before he finished the sentence. "I was her first home," she said, standing in front of him, refusing to move. "I'm going with you." Matteo looked at her for a long moment and understood, more than he wanted to admit, that no mother could be ordered to wait quietly while her child was missing. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, and they moved together into the dark. Within the hour, Matteo had shut down half the city. Roads closed, every contact called, every dock, warehouse, bar, and diner under his control locked tight. Every man he trusted ordered into the streets with a single instruction: find Nico Varela. He moved through his own organization, like a man tearing down a house he had spent years building, room by room, without hesitation, because the only thing that mattered now was behind one of those doors. He wasn't protecting his reputation anymore. He only wanted the girl brought home. Lily, terrified but sharper than anyone gave her credit for, left a trail as she was carried through the city. A smear of blue crayon dragged along a brick wall. A scrap of Bunny's ribbon caught on a chain-link fence. A small drawing of a bridge pressed into the seat of the car that eventually stopped. Glimpsed through a rain-streaked window, even as she was carried away from everything familiar. Sophie recognized it instantly. The old iron bridge near the abandoned meatpacking district, a route she'd walked once, years ago, before everything in her life became about surviving one day at a time. Sophie stared at the drawing until her breath caught. She had seen that broken freezer door once before, years ago, on the old loading road behind the meatpacking district. She had walked past it without knowing it would one day become the difference between losing her daughter and finding her. Matteo's face hardened as the pieces aligned. An old warehouse in that district had once belonged to the Calder family, rivals who had spent years trying to unravel everything Matteo had built. If Nico had taken Lily there, he hadn't just betrayed Matteo out of fear. He had been working with the Calders all along. The warehouse was dark, cold, and silent except for the echo of footsteps against concrete and the steady drum of rain against a broken tin roof. Matteo entered first, Sophie close behind him, despite every instinct in his body telling him to leave her outside. his men fanning out through the shadows, flashlight beams cutting through decades of dust and rust like blades through fog. Sophie's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had spent weeks being told her fear was irrational, her daughter's memory unreliable, her instincts something to be managed rather than trusted. Now, walking into a warehouse that smelled of rust and rainwater, she understood that every one of those instincts had been right all along. Lily was held near a rusted metal staircase, small and shaking, still clutching what remained of Bunny. Thomas was a fool, Nico said, his voice echoing off the high rafters, no longer bothering to pretend. He thought a little red notebook could end me. He hadn't fully confessed, not yet. He still believed, in the cold, careful way men like him always believed, that without proof, a broken little girl's pointed finger meant nothing. That was when Nolan's voice crackled through Matteo's earpiece. Following the bridge sketch in Lily's drawings, his men had found a metal box hidden near the old pilings. Tomas Vega's red notebook, water-damaged but intact. The final page held a wax seal, pressed by a ring exactly the shape Lily had drawn over and over for weeks. The wax seal was not just similar. It carried the same broken edge along the raven's wing, the tiny flaw Matteo remembered from the night he gave Nico that ring. A flaw no copy would have known to keep. Tucked inside the back cover was a note in Tomas Vega's handwriting. If this reaches you, Matteo, then I was right about Nico. I am sorry I did not come sooner. I thought loyalty meant silence. I learned too late that silence is how traitors survive. Matteo held the notebook up in the flashlight beam, and for the first time, Nico's composure cracked. He looked from the seal to Nico's hand. For 10 years, he had mistaken that ring for loyalty. Now it was the mark that proved betrayal. You are really going to throw away a brother, Nico said, quieter now, almost wounded, for a cashier and a broken little girl. Sophie stepped forward before Matteo could answer. She is not broken, she said. You are just afraid of what she remembers. Matteo's eyes never left Nico's face. No, he said. She was the only one brave enough to point at the monster. Something in Nico's expression finally gave way. Not remorse, but the particular fury of a man who had spent a decade being trusted and never imagined that trust could be outweighed by a 6-year-old's crayon drawing. He lunged for Lily, using her stillness as one last piece of leverage. Matteo stepped forward slowly, offering himself in exchange, calm and deliberate, laying down every card he had left. Nico hesitated, wanting Matteo alive long enough to watch everything he'd built come apart. That hesitation was the only opening Sophie needed. Sophie stepped sideways, drawing Nico's eyes away from Lily for half a second. You were never afraid of Matteo, she said, voice shaking but clear. You were afraid of a little girl with a blue crayon. Nico's jaw tightened. That was all Sophie needed. She caught her daughter's eyes across the room and made the small, familiar gesture from a game they'd played 100 times at home. Rabbit run. Lily understood instantly. She dropped low, the way she'd practiced hiding 1,000 times, and ran. Matteo's men closed in the same instant, overwhelming Nico before he could react. There was no need to describe what happened next in detail, only that it ended quickly, and that Nico did not walk away from it as the man who had once been called brother. Matteo looked down at him, cold and even. You killed Tomas in the dark, he said. You will answer in the light. Nico was taken away in silence, stripped of 10 years of trust that would never be given back to him by anyone in that world. Sophie dropped to her knees and pulled Lily into her arms, crying so hard she could barely breathe, running her hands over her daughter's hair. her face, her small, trembling shoulders, checking for injuries and finding only exhaustion and fear, and underneath it all, a stubborn, unbroken spark that was entirely her mother's daughter. Matteo stood a few feet away, bloodied but calm, watching the reunion he had risked everything to make possible. Careful not to intrude on something that belonged only to a mother and her daughter. Lily lifted her head from her mother's shoulder. For the first time since the alley, since the rain, since 4 whispered words that had silenced her for weeks, she looked directly at Matteo and spoke clearly. "He believed me," she said. Matteo lowered himself to one knee, careful not to come too close. "I should have believed you the first time you pointed," he said quietly. "I am sorry it took me so long." Lily looked at him for a moment, still trembling, still wrapped in her mother's arms. Then she gave the smallest nod. Sophie broke down completely at the sound of her daughter's voice. 3 words that meant more than any sentence Lily could have spoken. It meant she was coming back. Tomas Vega's red notebook, recovered exactly where Lily's fragmented memory had led them, proved everything the city had refused to believe for weeks. Nico's betrayal. The money paid to Harold Finch to cut Sophie loose. The deleted 12 minutes of camera footage. The threat note slipped under an apartment door. The ledger connecting Nico to the Calder family for years without Matteo's knowledge. The people who had mocked Lily learned, one by one, exactly how wrong they had been. The officer who had written nothing down was made to answer for it. Matteo brought Sophie and Lily back to the same police station where her report had once been ignored. This time, no one looked away. Lily's blue crayon drawings were placed across the front desk one by one. The ring, the scar, the alley door, the bridge, the red notebook. The officer who had once written nothing down was made to write her name correctly this time. Not as a disturbed child, not as a problem, as a witness. Harold Finch was exposed and investigated for the payment that had pushed a grieving mother out of the one steady job she had left, his quiet business decision unraveling into a very public one. Sophie didn't gloat. She didn't need to. "My daughter was never crazy," she said simply. "You just didn't want to listen." Matteo offered her everything a man like him could offer: money, permanent protection, a new life built entirely on his terms. Sophie refused, gently but completely. "I don't need a cage with better furniture," she told him. Matteo studied her for a long moment, and something in his chest, something that had spent years mistaking control for care, finally understood the difference. "Then no cage," he said. "Only a door. If you ever need it, Rosa's is open." It wasn't possession. It wasn't ownership. It was, for the first time in Matteo Cross's life, protection offered without expecting anything in return. Months passed. Sophie began working days at Rosa's diner, instead of dangerous night shifts at a store that had never once protected her. Sunlight through the windows now, customers who knew her name instead of strangers who barely looked up. The change felt strange at first, the way safety always does after a long enough absence. She caught herself checking locks that didn't need checking, glancing at doors that stayed closed, waiting for a version of danger that no longer had any reason to come looking for her. Lily started therapy, her voice returning in small, steady pieces the way spring returns after a long winter. Some mornings were harder than others, and Sophie learned to wait them out with patience instead of panic, understanding now that healing rarely moved in a straight line. She still carried Bunny everywhere, stitched back together by Rosa's patient hands, one new button eye slightly different from the other. A small imperfection Lily refused to let anyone fix. Matteo converted the diner's upper floor into a quiet shelter for mothers and children who needed somewhere safe to land. No questions asked, no price attached to kindness. He funded it quietly, without his name on any plaque, the way a man learns to give when he's finally stopped needing credit for it. The corner booth where Sophie and Lily had once hidden, frightened and out of options, became known among the staff simply as Lily's Corner. New families sat there sometimes now, women with tired eyes and children clutching whatever comfort object had survived the trip. And Sophie always made sure they got a second bowl of soup, no questions asked, the way Rosa once did for her. Matteo visited often. He never pushed. He never demanded anything Sophie wasn't ready to give. He simply showed up, kept his word, and let a 6-year-old girl decide, in her own time, that he wasn't something to be afraid of anymore. Some evenings he sat across from Sophie in a booth, long after closing, saying very little, content to exist quietly in the same space she occupied, and slowly, carefully, the way trust is rebuilt. One honest day at a time, Sophie began to let him closer. One afternoon, Lily ran across the diner holding a fresh drawing, blue crayon bright against white paper, 4 figures standing outside a small building that looked exactly like Rosa's front door. Sophie, Lily, Rosa, and Matteo. Above them, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, one word: home. They called Lily Bennett crazy because the truth sounded inconvenient coming from a frightened child. But one little girl pointed at the monster. One mother refused to stop believing her, and one feared Mafia boss finally learned that real power isn't making people afraid. Real power is protecting the ones no one else will believe. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe, and tell us which moment moved you most. Was it Sophie refusing to give up on Lily? Was it Matteo choosing to believe a child over the man he trusted? Or was it Lily finally saying, "He believed me"? Your comments help us keep telling stories about justice, protection, and the families we choose.